Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. This is a signal honor for me because I have known Dr. Dan since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Okay? I guess that's in folklore too, really. But since I was a little kid, so it's a signal honor to introduce an internationally known shiro. All right, as I'll be brief, as she stated, requested. Dr. Dance is Professor Emerita of both the University of Richmond and Virginia Commonwealth University. She received her BA and MA in English from Virginia, what is now Virginia State University, and her doctorate, oh, all right, all right. I'll pause again. And her doctorate in English from the University of Virginia. She's the author of 3 literary studies, including In Search of Annie Drew, the mother and muse of Jamaica Kincaid. Her numerous folklore studies, such as Honey Hush, an anthology of African American women's humor, Shuckin' and Jiving, folklore from contemporary Black Americans, and From My People, 400 years of African American folklore and anthology, have resulted in her being dubbed the Dean of American Folklore. And also, as I learned, also the Dean of Folk Culture. Okay. Without further ado, I want to introduce to you Dr. Dance, but I want to add at the end that Dr. Dance attributes her success to her grounding in African American culture, and she has always committed herself to collecting, preserving, interpreting, and disseminating that culture. We present to you now Dr. Daryl Dance.
Good evening, good evening. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many friends and new relatives and members of Elam Baptist Church, including our beloved minister. So I'm excited. I hope they won't correct me too often, but I'm delighted for this opportunity. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I think we should always pause to thank the board and the staff here at the Black History Museum. Thank them for inviting me and thank them for all the work they've done in planning this program and all the programs they do through the years. Thanks to all the groups who regularly donate funds and expertise to this museum. Thanks especially to the pioneers who laid the groundwork. And a special acknowledgement to my former student and dear friend Adele Johnson for her brilliant leadership from 2017 until her death in 2021. Institutions such as our museums and churches have been and continue to be the bedrock of Black communities. And I come this evening to pay tribute to one extraordinary little church in Charles City County. But before I begin with the particulars about Elam Baptist Church, I want to very briefly discuss the historical context from which it and all of our early churches evolved. The history of the Black church does not begin with buildings listed in archival records, but with the earliest African Americans in the colonies who gathered in slave dwellings with a pot turned upside down to muffle the noise, or in hush harbors, hidden places away from the masters. Enslaved people throughout the South, despite the severe restrictions under which they lived, devised some opportunity where they could meet together, preach and pray, sing and dance, and sometimes plot. For many of the slave uprisings grew out of these early church meetings. The earliest churches were not buildings. Our forebears knew the truth of the biblical dictum, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Such was the beginning of the First Baptist Church of Williamsburg, often cited as the first Black church. It began as a secret hush harbor on a plantation. The congregants were later given a carriage house as their meeting place, and in 1856 they built a church. From the earliest days, some Blacks also worshiped with whites in churches on plantations or in segregated areas of churches in the community. As might be expected, such churches were owned and largely governed by whites. Several black churches grew out of mixed congregations, sometimes because the whites handed the church building over to the black members, and in other instances because white members helped black members, worshipers, build a separate house of worship. Now, the question is, which black churches are considered the earliest? Which one was first? There has not been much consistency of definition among those declaring the order in which black churches evolved. Just recently, on September 19, 2022, some of you heard former Governor Wilder in his Wilder School Symposium lecture say that the first was his home church, First African Baptist Church here in Richmond, Virginia. The First Baptist Church on Harrison Street in Petersburg is often cited as the oldest, probably starting actually in Charles City on the Bird Plantation. Another early black church is the Gillfield Baptist Church of Petersburg, which began as an integrated congregation in Prince George County and later moved to Petersburg. Clearly, all of these churches have a remarkable history, and they deserve a great deal of credit for establishing and maintaining a place of worship for their communities during the dark days of slavery. However, one little church that deserves special recognition is the Elam Baptist Church in Charles City County. I am here to share the remarkable story of that church with you today and to declare that the Elam Baptist Church, founded by free blacks in Charles City County, can lay claim to being one of the oldest continuous independent African American churches in the nation, perhaps certainly the oldest in the South. Elam is unique in that it was conceived by blacks, organized by blacks, built on land owned by blacks, represented in the Dover Association by blacks, had no ties to any white church, and has continued as a body for 212 years. Elam also has the distinction of writing and publishing its own history in 1910 in celebration of their 100th anniversary. Pictured here is the cover of that history, the history of Elam Baptist Church. Except for a copy at the Library of Virginia, this is, to my knowledge, the only extant copy of the history. And I'm grateful to Dinah Mae Christian, who entrusted this copy to me when she moved from the area. The history of Elam Baptist Church tells us that the Elamites laid the foundation for the Elam Baptist Church in 1810. The church was accepted into the Dover Association in 1813, but its worship services began much earlier, actually between 1775 and 1810, where they preached and met in a log cabin. In 1810, according to the history, Abram Brown, who is my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and Nada's great-great-great-great-grandfather, and several other members went to Petersburg and joined the First Baptist Church there. They went to Petersburg and joined the First Baptist Church there. Such a simple statement, a bare historical detail, but it contains nothing of the realities of what my ancestors did. Try to imagine their lives and situations as free blacks who were forbidden to vote or carry arms. A series of other laws restricted where they could travel, whether or not they could own boats, under what conditions they could ride in a carriage, where they could work, where they could live, with whom they could associate, what education they could seek, what literature they could possess, with whom they could interact, and what so-called infractions could terminate their freedom. A trip to Petersburg was no random undertaking. Consider, too, what a long and arduous trip that was. just to make it from Charles City to Petersburg, more than 25 miles. I tried to depict in a fictional novel I wrote entitled Land of the Free Negroes something of that journey. I envisioned the moment when Abraham, despite all the realities that faced him, declared he was going to church in Petersburg, probably steeling his spirit by telling himself, I think I can. I think I can. I think I can get up before dawn and feed my animals and put on my church suit. I think I can. I think I can pack some food and water. Traverse miles of slave plantations, dodging paterolas wanting to check my free papers. I think I can embark in an unwieldy dugout at Queens Creek and row onto the James River with its rough waters and angry winds. I think I can. I think I can struggle against the tide and battle whatever unfavorable elements I encounter. I think I can row those 8 miles to the mystic Appomattox River and steer my way to City Point. And I think I can tie up my dugout and trudge along hot and dusty fields the remaining distance to the church. Abraham was no doubt reassured during his travels that once he reached his goal, he would joyously join like-minded believers, sing and pray, inquire and learn, and dream of a church for black people in Charles City. Of course, after an inspirational day at church, he had to set out on that harrowing return trek. I have often imagined that journey. Nothing that you or I can fathom can possibly fully recount the challenges, frustrations, fears, exhaustion, hunger, thirst, discomfort, even pains and dangers Abraham and his fellow travelers endured. But all the time he was making that challenging voyage, the committed Abraham was determined to build a church in his little community called Freetown. Build a church? Another simple statement, the implications of which we in our comfortable 21st century world cannot truly imagine. Imagine a colored man in 1810 envisioning building a church in a land where it was becoming more and more difficult for free blacks to even remain in the state of Virginia. Further, free blacks were hated and reviled elements of the society. Some declared that their situation was worse than slavery, for at least the slave had the protection of a master. Notwithstanding all these obstacles, Abraham bravely set out to achieve his goal. No matter the challenges, I know he had to remind himself over and over again, I think I can build that church. And he boldly and resolutely charted his course. With the aid of his brethren from the First Baptist Church of Petersburg, he and his Freetown colleagues met in a log building on Abraham's property where they worshiped and planned. Beginning in 1812, Abraham started attending business meetings of a white congregation at the Baptist Church in Charles City. At that first meeting, the records show Abraham met with them to discuss the organization of Elam and matters respecting their constitution. The white church says that Elam representatives, quote, were invited to seats with us, so apparently they were well received. With the inspiration from these interactions, Abraham and his companions laid the foundation for the Elam Baptist Church. The history of the church notes that the early services were conducted by local or neighborhood preachers, frequently known as chairbackers. Historian Luther P. Jackson believes that Abraham was one of those who used to preach, which he might well have done even legally during that time, because it was not until 1832 that he would not have been allowed to preach. It was in October 1813 that the Elam Baptist Church decided to seek admission to the Dover Association, the major state Baptist association. Imagine the audacity of this little colored church presenting themselves to the Dover Association for membership. Elamites must have thought and thought and thought about it And as they were wont to do, they concluded, we think we can. We think we can. They appointed Abraham, the delegate, to go with their letter seeking admission to the Dover Association, whose minutes read, received a letter from a Baptist church of colored people in Charles City County called Elam, requesting admittance into this association. Being satisfied they were orderly, respecting their faith and practice, they were admitted with their messenger. What Abraham and his companions had accomplished is more unique than anyone at the time could imagine. Elam Baptist Church, founded and owned by black members, seems to have been the only black church not required to have white men representing the church in the Dover Association and in other Baptist associations. Churches like the First Baptist Church of Williamsburg and Guilford Baptist Church were denied admission into the Virginia Portsmouth Baptist Association until, and I'll read the comments, they admitted them on the understanding they would be represented in the association by white delegates from the Market Street Church. Elamites now decided that they had reached the point where they were ready to move beyond their little log church. They were confident they could build an edifice in their community, no small task, not even a reasonable task for folks in their position and time, but they were determined and they were prepared. In 1818, Abraham, then church clerk, and his wife ceded a plot of land to the church for the construction of a place of worship. The tiny body of worshipers thought they could build and validate a church, and they did. And the little church that could grew and grew and grew. During Abraham's lifetime, he witnessed a considerable growth in the membership of Elam, it having grown to 197 the year before his death in August 1840. Elam Baptist continued to grow. By 1845, there were 245 members, 1852, 400 members, 1853, 458. Now, this is the only year in which there were white members listed, and that shot the membership up very high. I'm not sure, haven't been able to determine what, but I imagine something probably happened to their house of worship, and temporarily they associated themselves with Elam. By 1860, there were only 146 members, reflecting, no doubt, the new rulings regarding slave attendance and the increasing vigilance as whites more and more feared slave insurrections. It is an understatement to say that from 1819 onward, whites who saw what had been accomplished in this little antebellum church were nothing less than astonished, as shown in a lengthy letter from one Eben, I'm ahead of myself now. Well, I don't see that now. I'll get back on track hopefully soon. But I have a letter from one Eben Horsford, a European immigrant, slave owner, and Harvard professor, who just happened by Elam Baptist Church in 1852. He was amazed at the large number of free blacks in the congregation, and a bit intimidated, he wrote a 2-page letter to his mother telling her about what he had seen. In keeping with the laws of Virginia and the dictates of the Dover Association, the first 3 officially recorded pastors of the church were white men. However, during this time, the history notes the leaders and speakers were black members of the church. This despite the fact that in 1832, the Code of Virginia declared that no slave, free, Negro, or mulatto shall preach or hold any meeting for religious purposes, either day or night. The penalty for doing so was no more than 39 lashes. But the little church that could did meet and did preach. The white pastors were there, but they were merely figureheads. This was the case with the last white minister, Reverend Christian, of whom the history records, the members seem to have been very well satisfied with his services, which were nominally nothing, as he only came to be in place according to the law. Imagine, if you can, the courage of this group of determined men and women who put on a show of conformity at the same time that they, in effect, conducted their services as they damned well pleased. Still, there was no doubt that the members of the church were relieved when, after the Civil War, they no longer had to have white ministers, even for show. We can see that the Elamites who wrote their own church history were masters at the black art of signifying, when on page 16 they proclaimed, "When the time came that made it possible to dispose of the services of the Reverend J.H. Christian, there seems to have suddenly heaved in sight an effulgence of light, bespeaking the dawn of a new era." Oh, this little church that could. Elam's first official colored pastor was Abram's son, Reverend Samuel Brown. Ordained in 1860, he was, according to the history, the first regular elected and ordained colored pastor after the Civil War. He served as pastor of Elam Baptist Church for 21 years, and he was called by many the most prominent black citizen of Charles City, and he was praised for his eloquence and his force. Let me see where we are here now. I can't do anything with technology. I wanted to show you something. That's the tombstone of Reverend Samuel Brown, and it's one of the earliest legible tombstones in Elam Cemetery. Elam has been led by a number of noteworthy, well-prepared ministers, all of whom deserve fuller recognition, especially the long-serving Reverend George W. Watkins. Among the most prominent of our ministers are two names familiar to Richmonders, Reverend Gordon P. Hancock and Reverend Miles Mark Fisher. Elam is currently being led by its first female minister, the dynamic Reverend Helen Washington Randall, whom I hope you get a chance to say hello to tonight. Time does not allow the fascinating details about the growth and development of history and the burning and rebuilding of two structures. Here is the current structure built in 1928 and the annex built during 1966 and 1967. There's no time to discuss a number of items that would be interesting to discuss about the church services and so forth. I'm going to focus on three goals and achievements of the church. Elamites from the earliest days were determined to provide a place to worship God. And this they have consistently done, opening their doors from the beginning to their slave brethren and anyone who chose to enter. As time passed and the fear of slave insurrections increased, especially after the Nat Turner Rebellion, the slave masters would not allow their slaves to continue to worship in Elam. Since that time, the first church established out of Elam was Old Mount Zion, established for the slaves. Since that time, several other churches, 12 by some accounts, developed directly or indirectly out of Elam. Though the official accounts of the separations that led to the development of the first churches to grow out of Elam suggest the need for churches more conveniently located in particular communities, it is possible that racial issues and color prejudices may have been a contributing factor to some of those offshoots. A final motivation to leave was to enjoy more spirited services than were possible at Elam, long noted for being a very quiet church. The second goal of Elam was to promote education. Despite the restrictions regarding education for blacks, Elamites were always committed to education, and a remarkable number of them were literate. Indeed, one report by William H. Sloan of the Freedmen's Bureau noted of the Elam community in 1868, there's quite a large settlement of colored people who were free before the war, and among these are many who, in point of intelligence and education, will compare favorably with the whites of the county. John M. Koski points out that when the Freedmen's Bureau visited Charles City in August 1866 to inquire about education, they found that this very respectable man with some education was already teaching at Elam Church. I suspect that these were not the first classes taught at Elam by its previously mentioned minister, Reverend Brown. But with the Civil War over, it was no longer necessary to conceal them as a little church that could, obviously did. As soon as the Civil War ended, Elamites began openly building independent schools to educate their children. Schools on their land, with their money, and with their labor, and staffing them themselves, with one brief exception when they hired a white teacher for a short period in their second school. The first school that was out in the open was Bullfield Academies. Bullfield Academy. A linguist could have a field day with the language of these Elamites and what that language implies about them. They didn't just think they could build a school. They thought they could build an academy. Schools after Bullfield Academy were built in conjunction with other Charles City churches. The first time the county contributed to any of these schools was the fourth school built next to Elam in 1923. To build that school, the black community was required to pay $5,000 and to pay interest on the $1,200 the county borrowed to contribute to the school, a laughable and measly input from the county for what was to be regarded as a public school, of course, a colored public school. Legendary early teachers in Charles City included Daniel Webster Brown and A.Q. Franklin, both members of Elam. Most of the later teachers and principals at Ruthville High School and both of the first two supervisors were members of Elam. What a success Bullfield Academy and the later schools were. These schools prepared and sent their students off to numerous colleges. A few went to Hampton, Virginia Union, Morgan, and White Northern universities. But students went in droves to Virginia State College. I could count among these Elamites in my family who went to Virginia State College. My mother, 2 grandparents, at least 9 aunts and uncles, and scores of cousins. Here is a picture of Samuel Allen Brown III. He's the second one right there. He was a member, and this is a very interesting historical fact, of the last class in 1902. The state, of course, never wanted it to be a college, and by 1902, they took away the college and added an industrial institute instead. So he was in what is called the last class. Elam always gave annual gifts to its students in college. Remembering the differences these gifts made to me, in 1993, I endowed a small fund at Elam to provide a tiny gift to selected college students. And the person who handles that fund is here with us tonight in case you want to contribute to it. The first recipient of this grant is now the first female county administrator in Charles City, appointed in 2017. And another little aside I want to mention. I have witnessed with some pride that 5 of the last 6 recipients of the grant have been males. Of course, you know I delight in women's achievements, but during a time when black males are declining in higher education, in the professions, in business, it is reassuring that Elam is still helping to shape strong black men and women. Elam has always contributed to the education and development of its members by providing strong, determined, dedicated, intelligent, industrious, and dignified models whose achievements and accomplishments showed other Elamites that they too could. Elam constantly developed organizations of every ilk that informed, researched, motivated, and pointed the way. Groups that were fun and inspirational, but also groups that set high bars, made challenging demands, and insisted upon ethical behavior. Groups with inspirational and revealing names, like the Intellectual and Industrial Associations, the Willing Workers, the Goodwill Club, the Bible Study Group, the Little Helpers Club, the Busy Bee and Music Club, the Memorial Association, the Centennial Club, the Centennial Needlework Club, the Goodwill Club, and the usual, the American Red Cross, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts. This is a picture of a Sunday school class. Is there anybody else here who was in that class? Is anybody here who's in that picture?
My sister Kathleen.
Okay, I think Larissa too.
She might, yeah, Lois is.
Yeah, Larissa's there too. And I'm there, and you'll get a prize if you can pick me out later. Here I am pictured being taught by Mrs. Thelma Watkins when we received the wonderful gift of a new Hammond organ from Dr. Charles Franklin, who is pictured here. He was a renowned physician to whom it is said MCV and doctors as far away as Massachusetts referred their white patients to him for treatment. He held a number of firsts in medicine in the state. Elam Church planned trips to take members to programs and events, to educational institutions, to conferences, to parks and beaches. In addition to all those trips to Bible studies, Sunday schools, summer programs, and so forth, the church also regularly planned programs for which children were meticulously groomed to sing, act, and speak, enunciate. My first recitation was at the age of 3. When my name was called, I confidently walked to the pulpit. I leaned over the railing and said, "Mother, I forgot mine." My mother promptly provided the first 2 words, and I stood tall and dramatically intoned. "My chimney's small. Old Santa's fat, but he gets in spite of that." Much applause followed my earliest lecture in overcoming challenges. My first time as a featured speaker at a program was at Elam on October 9th, 1956. And an Elamite invited me to present my first keynote speech at a university, St. Paul's College, in 1972. I use myself as an example, but scores of other young people have, in a similar manner, been influenced by this church. Many years later, in 2010, when my 9-year-old granddaughter introduced me at Elam, the church erupted in loud acclaim and a standing ovation. Such enthusiastic support has, in many black churches, provided the encouragement critical to the development of young scholars, orators, and activists. Elam Baptist Church also recognized the need for recreational facilities for their families, and they promptly initiated significant action, building the Fair Building in 1919 on land given by Bill Jones and Edward Jones. The community later developed the Charles City Recreational Center. Over a period of years, Elam and other churches in the county labored tirelessly raising funds with which during the 60s they completed a community recreation center that included a recreation building, a swimming pool, tennis courts, playground, and baseball field. Numerous individuals contributed, including a few whites. In 1974, they turned the mortgage-free facility over to the county, and it now serves the Black, Indian, and white community. Through its support, its example, its guidance, and encouragement, the little church that could sent its children and their children's children out to found banks, build businesses, establish at least 4 schools, lead churches, serve in the military, establish magazines, write books, excel in sports, and enter all of the professions, including one woman who preceded the Hidden Figures as a computer engineer at NASA, including the photographer nicknamed Gory Brown for filming many horrifying national and international scenes and ultimately dying while filming the Jonestown Massacre. Some of you are old enough to remember that, including first black psychiatrist in Richmond, the first black female architect in Virginia, the first black woman to be accepted in UVA's medical school, and the first black woman police officer in Richmond. Some Elamites have claimed that Charles City produced more doctors than any city of any size in the United States from the end of the 19th through the first half of the 20th century, and that most of them or their forebears grew up in Elam. I don't have the statistics in hand, but Dr. Will Brown, whom some of you remember, would have run them off for you right here. But I do know a staggering number of blacks who came out of families in Charles City. Within about 5 miles of the church, I could point out to you at least 5 houses of Elamites that produced 2 or more doctors through the generations. For one example, my grandmother's 5 brothers were in the medical field. This is one of her older brothers, Milton, right here, in his medical school graduation class at Harvard. His niece claims that he was the head of the class at Harvard, but they didn't have the ratings when I went to try to check that one out. So he was the head of his class at Harvard. Elam was from the beginning a politically active congregation. And this is the third goal that I want to stress. Elam emphasized a commitment to citizenship and a determined drive for freedom and equality. Even during the early days of worship in the old log cabins, the father of Abraham and 25 other colored men from Charles City fought in the Revolutionary War. A number of the members of the family that helped to establish Elam. This monument to them proudly stands at the entrance to the Elam Cemetery. Probably, I'm told, no other community or county had so many men of color who were patriots. The lot of the early Elamites, never fair or equal, worsened during the Civil War. Nonetheless, throughout the Civil War, free blacks in Elam were very activist, convinced that they would be enslaved if the Confederacy prevailed. This period was obviously a traumatic time for them. That they would be particularly vulnerable is also obvious. The state legislature passed laws allowing the impressment of slaves and free Negroes into its labor forces. And some of the Elamites were impressed into military service in the Confederacy. A lot of them found ways to get out of that. My grandfather is one of them. This is Robert Spencer Brown. He paid off the sergeant to let him go when they impressed him. But he was very active, apparently, in the cause of the Confederacy. He claimed, and this is in a written claim that he made, I have acted as guide to the Union soldiers and have given them all the information I could get. I have carried letters to and from Richmond. Elamite Sylvanus Tyler Brown likewise detailed his aid to the Union Army, taking a scout from that army to see the position of the Confederates and back to secure the place, carrying letters to Union men, and helping white and colored people escape to the Union lines. Sylvanus was known as a river runner, and the Confederates advertised a reward for his capture, dead or alive. He was arrested and sentenced to be sold into slavery in 1863, but ultimately granted a pardon. he holds an interesting distinction. Mrs. Carter, my history teacher and my neighbor, told me that he won a pension from the state of Virginia for serving as a stable boy and body servant in the Confederate Army, and he also won a pension from the United States to claim a payment for damages suffered as a supporter of the Union. Judith Ledbetter, historian in Charles City, shared with me accounts of one interesting incident that was widely reported and that reflected the church's involvement in politics. A white radical Republican minister named James Honeycutt attended a 1867 meeting of the white and black, male and female Republicans of Charles City County, held at Elam and moderated by the colored pastor Samuel Brown. Honeycutt got in a little trouble and was arrested for trying to make resurrection by passing along incendiary information that might have caused blacks to rise up. But the point I wanted to make is that this was a church who very outwardly addressed itself to political issues during times when it was still not easy to do so. And as you can imagine, the little church that could, when they won the right to vote, started voting. Several of them even sought political office. They followed the model of their ancestors in the church of setting goals, educating themselves, and working cooperatively, diligently, fearlessly, and confidently toward the achievement of their dream. Like Abraham, they thought they could, and they did. Elamites were among the first blacks elected to political office in the county and state during Reconstruction. Samuel Brown became superintendent of the poor. A.Q. Franklin was a member of the Constitutional Convention. He was also a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. Franklin was also elected twice to the post of Commissioner of the Revenue. Now that was not an easy post to obtain because in order to obtain that post, you had to post $5,000 bond. And you know, when we're talking about a time when people were working for $17 a month, that was something. Abraham's great-grandson, William Sanford Brown, became the first black man on the Charles City County Board of Supervisors in 1891. And he was the only black supervisor of the era. Other appointments of offices included surveyors, overseers of public land, overseers of the poor, elections officers, justice of the peace. W.H.C. Brown, great-grandson of Abraham, applied for a license to practice law in the courts of Virginia. He later petitioned for the establishment of a post office in the community, which he dictated should be named Ruth Will, after the woman he loved, my great aunt, and himself. Ruthville may be the only post office of the time. Don't be overwhelmed by the grandeur of some of these structures. Ruthville may be the only post office of the time established at the petition of a black man and named as he dictated. Ruthville Post Office was also the only one that the United States Commission of Civil Rights found in the southern counties in the Black Belt that it studied between 1959 and 1961 that had a Negro serving as a postmistress. I actually believe that all the postmasters except one throughout the 20th century were black. Despite the fact that in 1902, with Virginia's new constitution, blacks were for the most part effectively disenfranchised by new laws designed to eliminate the black vote. Nonetheless, Elamites in large numbers continued to register to vote during these years, and a couple of them even continued to hold office. At a time when Negroes were virtually absent from the political arena, W.H.C. Brown, that I previously mentioned, registered a symbolic presence, at least, on the state level as the only Negro who attended the Republican State Convention in Roanoke in 1905, where he made the seconding speech for Judge L.L. Lewis for governor. Lewis lost, but he was there. Though voting was difficult from 1902 until the Voting Rights Bill of 1964, it is noteworthy that Elamites and other blacks in Charles City continued to vote in larger numbers than they did elsewhere in the South. Long before the civil rights movement's highly publicized protests against the disenfranchisement of blacks in the South, and long before the 1965 Voting Act's right, Elamites were registering complaints with the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office and the Electoral Board. The Charles City County Civic League, organized by Elamites, and the NAACP registered complaints. All of these operations operated initially out of Elam Church. They held classes to teach people to register and vote. They rallied blacks and introduced initiatives to increase black voter registration. They arranged transportation to the registrar's office. They visited black churches to encourage the vote. Charles City blacks employed methods early on that would later be more effectively utilized by a larger national movement in the 60s. That drive was so successful that by 1956, blacks in Charles City held a majority, 704 blacks to 549 whites and Indians. As scholar Johanna M. Lewis and others note, in 1961, blacks in Charles City constituted a higher percentage of local electorate than they did in any other county in the nation. Much of that is due to Elamite Edward T. Banks, who determined and set in motion a plan to be sure that there was a black on the electoral board, the school board, and the board of supervisors. Banks and others determined that they could, and they did. Several there were several victories that resulted. The political participation of blacks in Charles City has received some acknowledgement. Andrew Booney, in his study, The Negro in Virginia Politics, writes, "A lesson in the power of the ballot could be learned from that black belt county." A United States Commission on Civil Rights conducted a study between 1959 and 1961 of southern counties, and made this report. Charles City County is the outstanding example of political freedom and participation by Negroes. Charles City County is far ahead of the other 21 counties in according Negroes equal treatment in the area of administration of justice. There are 2 Negro justices of the and neither courtroom seating nor drinking fountains are segregated, although restrooms are. Substantial numbers of Negroes serve on both trial and grand juries in civil and criminal cases alike, and there were no reports of illegal police practices. This before the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the Voting Rights Acts of 1964 and 65. In the 1930s, 3 Elamites, 3 women, entered a battle to equalize teachers' salaries in Virginia. Wilnette Carter, Lois Jones, and Cordelia Banks, and some of their relatives are in the audience here. They were joined by other counties and represented by Oliver Hill, who was married to a descendant of Elamites. Hill won the case in 1940, his first civil rights victory. Despite all the noteworthy achievements of this little church that could, it is amazing how history and accomplishments of blacks in Elam have been overlooked, misrepresented, and denied. Here are a couple of scholars on black churches. Here's one who writes, "The Negro churches in rural Virginia were formed from white churches just after the Civil War." Another writes, "All of these antebellum Virginia Negro churches were under the control and supervision of whites. Their membership was considered as part of the parent white church. Their deacons were chosen by whites. The church property was owned by white trustees." They wrote and they published that, and that is tells us what most people do not know. 2 of the few historians who give accurate treatment to Elam are Luther P. Jackson and Henry H. Mitchell, whose name may be familiar to some of you. Jackson cites Elam as one of the early churches organized by Negroes and one of the few whose church property was owned by Negroes. And Mitchell declares, in fact, the earliest colored church of which this author has found record was the Elam Baptist Church of Charles City, founded in 1810. I, as some of you know, have long tried to verify the rich history of Elam Church, and I made that statement Mitchell made years before he did, but that's okay. Somebody else is joining, and that's fine. And then in 1998, with Darrell Lynn's help, we brought out a revised version. Virginia Historical Association and the majority media continue to ignore the historical relevance of the Elam Baptist Church. Though I made it a point to call the 100th anniversary celebration of this magazine of history and geography, the Virginia History and Culture, and the Times Dispatch gave no notice to the event. It goes without source that sources often prefer stories about blacks being told by white authors, or stories about blacks that picture white saviors, leaders, and mentors. Elamites, however, are accustomed to telling their own stories. Charles City native Carolyn Scott Blunt devoted 9 pages of her Rochester, New York-based journal About Time to cover Elam's 200th anniversary. Most importantly, however, of Elamites from California to Washington, D.C., and from New York to Georgia converged on Elam for a 4-day celebration of the 200th anniversary in September of 2010. There were sermons, prayers, proclamations, revelations, confessionals, speeches, tours, exhibits, banquets, reunions, and miscellaneous other celebrations. Those Elamites who remained here, those who returned here, and those who had never been here joyously joined together to pay tribute to the sacred holy ground that is the voices, sharing in the many expressions of love, appreciation, and devotion, heard through the years, reinforcing the mind-boggling impact this little church that could has had on generations of descendants. I'm going to share just a couple with you. One is this beautiful poem written by Wilnette Banks. I won't attempt to read it here, but it says something about the meaning of the church to the community, about her sadness when the church burned down, and about the fact that, as she put it, the spirit of the master lingers in the lives that were blessed of a noble generation who were faithful to the test. The reverence for Elam continues today for even those who never even saw the church. Those who never even saw the church regard it as a magical, legendary, almost fantastical place. Compelling and passionate accounts of the church persist in stories of generations of families, some of whom have never been to Charles City. When the church celebrated its 200th anniversary, a woman was there with her grandmother. Grandmother, am I doing something to make this noise? Grandmother was over 100 years old. The grandmother had never been to Charles City, but she had passed on through the generations the stories her parents had told her about Elam Baptist Church. When the granddaughter heard about the reunion, she determined that her grandmother would finally step into that revered church and celebrate with her Elam family the 200th anniversary. One final example comes from Harvard Professor Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, the first black woman to have a chair named for her at Harvard. In her book, Balm of Gilead, Journey of a Healer, she writes about the Elam church community that her father had told her about, an account so detailed that Sarah, more than 50 years later, could indicate names of the ministers and the exact amount of money paid to the ministers. Her father had told her the Elam church was more than a religious center. It symbolized the strength, pride, and dignity of this extended family. In Henry Louis Gates' book, he quotes this Sarah, who had never been to Elam, let me remind you, as telling him that Elam feels as if it is an absolute foundation, an anchor for my way of being in the world. Henry Louis Gates Jr. realized that in order to tell her story in his African-American lives, he had to include Elam. And so he arranged with me to have his crew spend an afternoon filming at our revered church. Just last month, on September 25th, Elam held its 212th anniversary and homecoming service with a moving sermon by the Reverend Richard W. Wills, Sr. Let me tell you, not even a COVID pandemic can hinder the little church that could from celebrating its homecoming and anniversary. Carefully avoiding close contact, Elam provided plastic bags containing memorabilia, gifts, its history, and the day's program as temperatures were checked. No collection was taken, but people left their gifts on a table. Elam even managed its traditional feast on the picnic grounds after the church service. There may have been no steaming platters from which one helped himself, and no overflowing punch bowls, but a sumptuous repast awaited us. We picked up veggies and salads in individual containers, hot dogs and hamburgers wrapped individually in Reynolds wrap, dessert in plastic bags, bottled water and drinks on the church lawn, and finally stopped at one station for fresh fish just fried outside by the bin. Masks were removed as we took our seats outside, enjoyed our traditional banquet on the grounds, and proclaimed the wonder of the little church that could. Here are the Reverend Helen Washington Randall, Deacon Henry A. Hayes Jr., and Deacon Leroy Atkins, who are with us tonight and who work with our small but ever dedicated, ingenious, and energetic Elam congregation to manage another one of its remarkable events, COVID or no COVID. Elam is, and for more than 212 years, has been that absolute foundation for generations of members who are blessed in this church, baptized in this church, raised in this church, married in this church, take the spiritual manifestations of this church with us wherever we go, pass Elam's traditions on to our descendants, and then return to lie down with our forebears in the church cemetery, a well-kept burial ground where a memorial to Abraham Jr. watches over the graves of his descendants. Even a number of those born, raised, or making their homes outside the area are returned upon their deaths to lie with their ancestors. Throughout their lives, they and their children's children have forever been emboldened by the little church that could, the church that they passionately recognize as an anchor of their way of being in this world. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. And before I have you make your comments, and I'm sure a lot of you have some additions and corrections to make, let me ask all of the members of the Elam Church who are here to stand. Thank you. Thank you. And I'd like, if you didn't already stand, those of you who are descendants of the founders of the Elam Church to stand. Thank you. And thank you to my other friends and colleagues and neighbors who attended tonight. Okay. Any commentary? Well, I hope you will all stay back and chat with each other. There's so many interesting people in this audience, who ought really to know each other. So stay back. Yes, Henry.
I didn't change the case up to the church. Because we are represented here by pastor folks, Dr. Helen Washington, my two cousins, Linda and Brenda, Althea and Gideon, and this is my wife Joe, and she's a member of Gilfield Baptist Church. But we are very, very proud of our history and our contribution to the community. And Dr. Dance and my sister who received them, Maurice, was one of those pictures of their kids up there. They were very good friends back in that teenage years. But I'm very, very happy that we can make Gary and Charles and we get it when we coordinate on the shadows, as they say,
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Other Charles City people who haven't yet stood, stand up and let us see you, because I see some other homies back there. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Reverend.
I think I would be amiss if I didn't have something to say, but I do want to thank you for that very gracious presentation regarding Elam Baptist Church. It does indeed have a place in my heart. I'm from a traditional old black Baptist church, which is none other than the Angel Visit Baptist Church in Dunsville, Virginia. And I too know how hard the people, even we're talking about those Baptists who work so hard as far as education and politics and doing things to make us better. I'm a product of a home of 8 children, a mother who went to Virginia State, a father who had a third-grade education, but who was a carpenter brick mason. And of those 8 children, 7 of those 8 children were all educated in the CIAAs and our black colleges and universities. And we were, as Elam did with their children, you were pushed forward, you were groomed for such a time as this. And I do, even now in the year 2022, I want it known that we continue to push our own, and we want to continue to lead and guide and direct our young people. We realize and know now that the world is in trouble. The world is in trouble, and it's going to take people like us to be able to reach down and to pick them up, to lead them and to carry them along the way. We thank you again so much for that very beautiful, beautiful presentation. Some things that I didn't even know myself. I found myself reading up.
Okay.
Sure, I knew what was going on, but some things I did not know. But we thank you. Be gracious to thank you.
Thank you so much.
For what you have done for Elam. We did talk about the scholarship that is given honor, and we are gracious for that as well. We have several young men of that scholarship, and we are thankful to God for what he continues to do in the life of the Elam Baptist Church. We are the little church that keeps.
Okay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes.
I'm sitting next to a woman, she's 102. She was born in Charles City, delivered by midwife. And when you speak of the churches that grew out of, I grew up here in
Really? Thank you so much for both of you for coming.
she